Well, Joel Skousen was on the Alex Jones show today, and he gave a very clear directive for the protesters there in Oregon, the gist of which is basically declare victory and come on home. Now, I thought that Alex offered some really key intel as well for some other things that might be going on behind the scenes. But now the media has been focusing David, on this growing militia aspect of the story. And, you know, of course, they're going to go with that narrative because it really ties into the right-wing radicalism rising in this country. That's what we really need to be worried about. But they're overlooking some other terrorists that are occupying federal buildings.
That's right. That's
our bloated government.
The federal government itself uses violence and intimidation to achieve political means, right?
Right.
That's the true definition of a terrorism. And, of course, there's this article that was on Drudge Report today talking about another sagebrush revolution. The congressman who is from that area, who knows the Hagmens, had some very interesting things to say. And we need to understand what people are really concerned about. And so he really put this into a context. And, of course, there's an even larger context than that. But let's put this in context as this congressman was saying. Let's go with this first clip. He talks about the overzealous bureaucracies and the Congress that does nothing.
I have seen what happens when overzealous bureaucrats and agencies go beyond the law and clamp down on people. I have seen what courts have done. And I have seen the time for Congress to act, and then it has not.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And we've seen this over and over again. Right. And, of course, what Congress has done, and I've pointed this out many times myself, they've abdicated their responsibility to write the laws to these bureaucracies. So they create a bureaucracy and they basically create them as a fiefdom. They say, you're going to be in charge of this aspect of the country or the economy or activities, and you can pretty much do whatever you wish to do, and they run with that. Right. Absolutely run with that.
Well, and we've seen also Harry Reid, you know, respond last year, basically calling these people exercising their constitutional rights terrorists.
Yes. So he wanted to put this in context. He wanted to give them some examples of some of the things that have happened in that community. And part of the context is to understand just how large this county is. He said there's only 7,000 people here, but it is 10 times the size of Rhode Island. He says it's larger than the state of Maryland. And then he had this to say about recent wildfires and their magnitude.
Miller Homestead wildfire in 2012 burned 160,000 acres. Mostly in this county, if not all, 250 square miles, quarter the size of the state of Rhode Island. That was just in 2012. The Berry Point fire that year in Lake County next door burned 93,000 acres. Last summer alone, we burned 799,974 acres across Oregon. That's both forest and high desert. 2012, 3.4 million acres burned in Oregon. There was another fire in Malheur County, the Long Draw fire in 2012 burned 557,000 acres, 5 times the size of Rhode Island. So 93,000 acres, 557,000 acres, 160,000 acres, all burning. The Hagmens are in prison tonight for setting a backfire that they admit to that burned 139 acres. And they will sit in prison, time served, and time going forward 5 years.
Wow.
Under a law that I would argue was never intended to mete out that kind of punishment.
Absolutely, because that law was passed to talk about terrorism. And as he says in this clip, he says, hey, you know, if you were setting a brush fire in L.A., where you've got tightly packed people, then maybe that was an act of terrorism. It should be addressed like that. But out in this area, they're talking about hundreds of thousands of acres just in that county that burned, and millions of acres that burned. 3.4 million acres in Oregon statewide in 2012. This is 139 acres. Right. Now, to contrast that, I want you to listen to what he says about how the BLM has conducted itself. I would call this the arsony of the BLM. Let's play that clip.
I've given you the size of the acreages that burn naturally. I haven't gotten into the discussion about how these fires are often fought and how the federal government frequently will go on private land and set a fire without permission to back burn. That happens all the time. In fact, in the Berry Point fire down in Lake County, they set fire on private timberland as a backburn while the owners of the property were putting out spot fires down in the canyon. I drove down there afterwards. They're darn lucky to have come out alive. There's nobody sentenced under the Terrorism Act there. Oh, heck no. It's the government. I can tell you a few years back in Harney County, because I went and held a meeting out there right as the fire was being put out, that the fire crews came in, went on private ground, lit a backfire on private ground behind a fence line that then burned out the farmer's fence, the rancher's fence, and burned all the way over and down into a canyon where there was a wetland, which would have been the natural break to stop the fire from the other side. You see, they never needed to burn that land. These things happen in the course of fighting fire. Doesn't mean they're right, but rare is it that somebody ends up 5 years in prison.
And of course, Leanne, what he's pointing out here is that you got a massive wildfire. People are trying to take care of this. Things are going to happen. This is such a minuscule amount of land compared to what the fire was doing. Like we said before, hundreds of thousands of acres are burning. 139 acres got onto their land. But then what does the BLM do? It's not just in these particular cases that the Congressman Walden was talking about. There's been multiple cases where they have destroyed livestock. They've destroyed buildings, not just a fence. A fence is an expensive thing, especially when you got that much fencing there. But they have destroyed private property, the grass, the buildings, the cattle, and refused to compensate people for this.
Right.
And they're not tried under any law. Nothing happens to the employees. They don't even get disciplined at work for doing a bad job, just as we saw with the gold mine that exploded and polluted the Animas River over 3 states and the Navajo Indian Reservation with heavy toxic metal. Nothing has happened to them. They're not accused of being terrorists, and of course they aren't terrorists. But they don't even get penalized for their incompetence or their maliciousness, if that's what that was, because there were people that said that was a deliberate attempt to get a super fund there. They were warned in advance that was going to happen. There's a lot with that. But nevertheless, we see this over and over again. So there's one standard for the government. They can do whatever they want to destroy people. But if you do something, you will be labeled as an arsonist and a terrorist and sent for mandatory minimums. He points out, this judge, and we've mentioned this before, said, I cannot in good conscience apply this sentence to them. He's being pressured by the federal government because they want their land. We've pointed that out. And that's the fundamental thing behind this. They want the land of the people who are there, just as we saw at the Bundy Ranch. They're the last people standing. Let's play this last clip real quickly. This is BLM arrogance.
Some of the agencies decided to reinterpret it. And the first thing they tried to do is shut down this kids' running camp because they said, well, too many, maybe more than 20, run down this canyon back up, as they had for many, many years. So they wanted to shut it down. So we had to fight them back, said, no, the law says historical standards. See, the bureaucracy wants to interpret the laws we write in ways they want. And despite the fact we created the first cow-free wilderness in the United States under this law, and said clearly in this law that it would be the responsibility of the government to put up fencing to keep the cows out as part of the agreement, the Bureau of Land Management said, no, we're not going to follow that law. And they told a rancher they had to build a fence. I networked with my Democrat colleague, Mr. DeFazio from Oregon, who was part of writing this law. I said, Peter, you remember that, right? He said, yeah, I didn't like it, but that was the case. BLM still wouldn't listen.
Okay, so we don't have time for that full clip, but what you can hear is that he's saying to his colleagues, says, you remember, they were going to pay for the fence, but now they're just ignoring that. That's his frustration, and he goes on for quite some time talking about what he went through to try to get them to obey the law that he wrote. Okay, and that's the furious thing about it, is that they will not obey the law. They will not obey the Constitution. They're there to essentially set up a complete control of people. When you understand that it's not just gun control, okay, it's land control, it's internet control, it's transportation control, it's healthcare control, and they're doing all of this by exceeding their authority. That's the real key to all of this, and that's what we have to take away from this, is that this isn't something that just affects these people in this area. It's very frustrating for this congressman. He got to tears at one point in talking about this.
You could see his
That's the background. We need to understand they're coming for all of these things if we don't understand what's behind this.
Absolutely, and people need to open up their hearts and have a little bit more compassion, even if they don't understand what's going on there in Oregon. Well, thank you, David, so much. Now stick around. We'll have more nightly news right after this.